December of 2019, I get this email from James. He said, we have to talk. There was an article in the Harvard Gazette. The guy's name is Hanan Tigay, and he wrote a book called The Lost Book of Moses. And it was about a Shapira scroll. Tabor and I both order the book, we read the book, and what we find is that Tigay assessed the information and came away with a Shapira scroll was a forgery. Well, here was one question that was nagging. I said, what did the scroll say? I'm curious. So I began to pore over it, and I found that the text from the manuscript could very well be an ancient manuscript of the Torah. They felt like the forger was copying from lapidary, from stone inscriptions. Here's what they knew. They had the Moabite stela, the Mesha stone. They had that, and they saw there are dots between words. The Siloam inscription is discovered in 1880. It had dots, but they had never seen it used on leather, so they said the forger is trying to play like he knows about ancient writing. Well, now we know. Emmanuel Tove says that at Qumran, there are 13 manuscripts written in paleo-hebrew.
Just like this?
Yes, they are written in paleo, and they have the word divided.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And today I'm with Ross Nichols, the Moses Scroll.
The Moses Scroll, Neil.
So this is an interesting book, and a lot of people like to wonder about, people's credentials when they write books about academic stuff. But there's also experience.
Yeah.
People who have that raw experience. They go to the sites, hands-on stuff. This is your guy for that. This guy's been. How many times have you been here in this?
This is trip 18, Neil.
18, but how many?
Kicking up dust.
But you've had trips here that 6 months long.
Yeah, I stay several months when I come. Usually if I come, I'm going to make the most of it. I'm going to try to stay 3 months, chase down whatever wild, crazy idea I'm looking at.
Yeah.
Lead tours like we're on together with you guys. And
yeah.
So that's part of it. Digging in the soil, that's what I really like to do.
Right. So, when I see that, it's something, I take that seriously. People who are hands-on and take that approach. We're talking about the Moses Scroll. Yeah. And before we even start, I just want to let people know, we're going to get into the basics on this. If you want to know more about it, the link's in the description where you can buy the book. Tell us a quick little rundown about why you wrote this book. Okay, excellent question. Let me tell you. So I'm sort of one of those guys, like you said. I don't have a PhD. I started off like so many people, just studying the Bible. I fell in love with the Bible, worked my way out of Christianity, worked my way out of fundamental Christianity. Years ago, I did a class called Following Jesus Out of Christianity, So then I take the next logical step and I turn to the Hebrew Bible. Well, from a fundamentalist standpoint, Neil, I kind of wanted to remain somewhat fundamentalist, Right.
You know what I'm saying? So I believe that the 66 books of the Bible are inspired, inerrant, the holy, all of that. I mean, that was my view. And then I began studying Hebrew very early, and I just pushed my way through the material. Well, as I moved into the Hebrew Bible, I carried some of that same fundamentalist approach. So now I'm looking at the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, and I felt like the real truth is here. But I took that same approach. Well, as I worked through it, I began to really delve into some of the academic works. I know you've worked through a lot of this material too. But what I began to notice, primarily after years of teaching through the Torah cycle of readings, the annual cycle of readings that go back all the way to Second Temple times, I began to notice some strange things. I began to question whether or not the traditional view that Moses had written the Torah was really valid. Could it stand the test? Traditionally we say that Moses wrote the 5 books. You can't pick up a Bible without seeing the heading Genesis, the first book of Moses, Exodus, the second book of Moses. Well, as I began to read, I started noticing something, and I didn't know this level of detail, but let me tell you, 592 times Moses is mentioned in the Torah, from the time we meet him in Exodus 2 until Deuteronomy 34:12. You take that section, you find Moses 592 times. Why would that trigger me? Because most people writing an account would not use the third person.
Right.
I started noticing things. It describes Moses' death. Well, we know that dead people don't write. So this is not something I discovered. This is something that academics had discovered all through primarily 18th, 19th century, up into Wellhausen and, all of his work. So I began to question whether or not Moses had written any of it. This led me to the discovery, and I'll tell it to you this way. I delivered a class that sort of unveiled this at a conference, a United Israel World Union conference in April of 2019, and this was the title, Finding the Hand of Moses in the Torah. The Torah within our Torah. Now the approach is this, right? You can sense, I know you're going to pick up on this, I still want to believe that Moses did write something, but what was it?
Right.
So I began to notice there are 7 places, and we may get into this more deeply, but I'll tell you just the high end of it. I noticed 7 things that the Pentateuch tells me that Moses wrote. But it's not from Moses' hand, it's from another author. Someone is telling me that Moses wrote something. Classic example, Deuteronomy 31 verse 9, Deuteronomy 31 verse 24 through 26 says, Moses wrote his Torah, gave it to the priest, and the priest put it mitzad ha'aron, beside the ark. So think about that. Moses wrote the Torah, the author of Deuteronomy tells us, and then it says he put it beside the ark. Well, that's somebody telling me Moses wrote the Torah. It's not Moses saying, I wrote the Torah, right? You get the difference.
Yeah, that's...
So the thing that got me was, I said, wait a minute. We still have 3 chapters of Deuteronomy left that, in other words, it can't be talking about Genesis 1:1 through Deuteronomy 34:12. So Neil, I then said, I have to find that book. There's a fundamentalist in me. Is there any trace of that book? For instance, the Torah mentions the book of Jasher in the book of Numbers.
I've always wondered about this.
Right. So
because we have a Jasher, but it's not the right one.
Yeah,
this
you
is
can
like
go
medieval.
on Amazon and get it, but it's not the book. So we have references to these ancient books, these sources that the authors, whoever they were, of the Pentateuch and other books in the Tanakh, we have references to these sources, but we don't have the sources. So my question was, has this book been lost?
Right.
So I set out on a journey, and I discovered that within the book of Deuteronomy, there's a first-person element to Deuteronomy. It's only in Deuteronomy. Now, if you open up Deuteronomy, you read Deuteronomy 1:1 through 5, and it's a narrator speaking. These are the words which Moses spoke on the other side of the Jordan between this place and that place, so forth and so on. And it's all third person. Guess who didn't write it? Moses. But then you begin seeing, now this is only Deuteronomy, Neil. You start seeing places where the writer, let's just be honest, I'm saying it's Moses. Some people would laugh at that. But here's the deal, it's in first person. So you get this feel where it says, and the Lord spoke unto me saying, well, he's talking first person. So that was what I was working on. Fast forward, I delivered that talk in April of 2019. Dr. James Tabor, good friend of mine. You guys know that we're good buddies. He writes me an email and he said, hey, December of 2019, I get this email from James. He said, we have to talk. There was an article in the Harvard Gazette, if I'm not mistaken, and it was about an author who had written a book. The guy's name is Hanan Tigay, and he wrote a book called The Lost Book of Moses, I believe is the title of his book. And it was about a Shapira scroll. So I read Tabor and I both order the book, we read the book, and what we find is that Tigay assessed the information and came away with he confirmed the scholarly consensus. So up front, I'm going to tell you, Neil, that academics, both at the time in the 19th century, all the way up through modern times, the majority of them say Shapira scroll was a forgery. Well, here was the one question that was nagging. I said, what did the scroll say? I'm curious.
Right.
Right? Because I hear you got all that, you say that you think it's a fake. Well, that's what they said, but I want to look at the raw data. Yeah, I'm not an easy, you can't convince me easily, give me the data. So I began to pore over it, and I found that the text from the manuscript, now if I can show you this.
Show it right here.
Yeah, this is A replica, obviously, and it's not to scale. It's a little bit big. I bought it off eBay, bro. You can get this off eBay. But this is one fragment. So the quick dirty of this is there were 16 strips of leather that were discovered in a cave in 1878, according to the story, by Bedouin. Now think about this, Neil. 1878. Actually, it was discovered in 1865. Yeah, it's paleo. So it's discovered in 1865, but in 1878, Moses Shapira, a scroll merchant, like he's working as an agent for the British Museum, he comes in contact with the Bedouin, comes to him and said, hey, you know, I got this scroll, you might be interested. So he buys the manuscript for next to nothing, and he sends the transcription. So you've studied paleo.
Yeah.
So he begins with paleo, and he's transcribing it in modern Hebrew letters. As he does, now there are 16 strips. Now it represents 2 manuscript copies of what Shapira believed could very well be an ancient manuscript of the Torah. Excuse me. So he takes this, sends it to a German scholar by the name of Schlottmann. Schlottmann looks at it and he says, he doesn't have this, he has the transcription. He writes him a scathing letter. He says, Shapira, this is a forgery. How could you dare suggest that something that doesn't agree with our authentic Bible is real?
Really? And what made him think that?
Because it didn't agree with the canonical text.
Really?
Yeah. By the way, this does have a version of the 10 Commandments, Neil, but it's not the version you know.
Really?
Now, that shouldn't have been a problem. Why? Because in the Bible, all the fundamentalists should know this, in the Bible we have 2 accounts of the 10 Commandments, the 10 words as they're called in Hebrew, Aseret HaDevarim. Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5. You put those side by side, they don't agree. There's differences. Now this is supposed to be the words of God from Mount Horeb, from Mount Sinai. So, but Schlottmann sends back a letter scathing Shapira and says, how dare you? So what ultimately happens with this is Shapira feels bad, you know, because he wants to be a good believer, and he puts it in a gold safe at the Bergheim Bank. He leaves it there, and guess what? It stays there for 5 years.
Wow.
But then he begins to think. He begins to hear about the academic critical assessment of the Torah. He comes across a book that was written in 1860 by a scholar by the name of Friedrich Bleek. Friedrich Bleek wrote a book in German. Germans are the best academics on the Bible, right? So particularly in the 19th century. 1860, the book was written. He gets a hold of it in about 1882. And he reads it and he comes away with this startling conclusion, and it's somewhat the same as what came to me. And that's this. The Torah, as we have it, the Pentateuch, was not written by Moses or about his time. So Shapira then said, wait a minute, this might be authentic. So he goes back, he gets a scroll out of the bank, and he says, that's it. I'm going back to the European scholars, and I'm going to show it to them again. Now he's convinced, Neil. He knows ancient scrolls. He knows old scrolls. Now here's the deal. This is 80 years. It was discovered 80 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Wow.
So now Shapira brings it to Germany, and there's...
So they don't even know that there's text that can survive that long.
No, that's it.
That's really important.
That's the point. Now get this, I'm going to tell you this piece. So in 1883, he's got the courage, he's got the conviction, he believes it's authentic, he doesn't care what they think. So he takes it to Germany, and by the way, he's got a couple of scholars, most people that come on now, the academics that still say it's fake, they don't know all the background.
They're just kind of,
they're parroting what they learned in graduate
appealing to the consensus,
school.
right?
Absolutely. So now I'm into this subject. I downloaded every single thing that the PEF, Palestine Exploration Fund, did. I downloaded every article from the Athenaeum, from all the British papers, and I read through the story, and I recreate that in the book. But the fast version of it is this. He brings it to Leipzig, Germany. And in Leipzig, 2 young scholars by the name of Hermann Goethe and Edward Meyer, they look at this and they believe it's real. Nobody knows this. It's only in the German personal correspondence between these two. But he believes it's real, they believe it's real. He takes this manuscript, they transcribe it, and they published it and I actually read and used their transcription. Then it goes to England, where David Christian Ginsburg, the great Masoretic scholar, he then transcribes it. So what I did, this is before I even decided for sure if I was going to write a book, I pulled those two transcriptions into one text, making a critical text for the first time. And I worked through it and I provided a translation of it. And you know what I found? Get this, Neil. Remember when I told you I was looking for what did Moses write?
Right.
7 things that the Pentateuch says Moses wrote. Guess what this document contains?
Those things.
Those things that Moses would have written.
Wow.
Now, I took that and I said, now I'm not being silly here. You know, I'm not just saying this is the scroll that Moses wrote, but I tell you what I do think. I think this gets us closer to the authentic, call it Deuteronomy. You know, like the first Torah, if you will. Because get this, it comes before all the priestly interpolations. If you would have, in the 19th century, if I were trying to create a fake, and I wanted to, let's say I looked at all the scholarly material and I said, you know, I'm going to fake them out. The one thing I would have put in it was chapter 12 through 26, all the priestly material. Because that's what a lot of scholars still believe that represents the earliest.
Yeah.
So that's what he would have done, but guess what's lacking in this? Every bit of that. I mean, you're going to have me back. We're going to have to talk about the details of what's there, what's not there, and what does that really mean?
Right.
I mean, it's just amazing.
Now, but I think this is a good breakdown of what this is. And as you can see, the last thing I want to ask you, this is the last thing I want to end on.
All right.
What is it about this that they looked at and say, nah, this has got to be, like, what are they seeing that makes academics say, this is a forgery?
Yeah, you hit on one of them. One of them is, they just didn't know. I mean, if I were a scholar in 1883 and you told me, hey, Dr. Nichols, we found a scroll, and I said, tell me about it. And they'd say, well, so the story is it was in a cave, kind of near the Dead Sea. And I'd say, wait a minute. It was near the Dead Sea? And you tell me that this is 2,000, 3,000 years old? There's no way. Almost without exception, the scholars of the day said there's no way that a leather scroll could survive in a cave.
But now we know that's not true.
Now we know. But listen,
wow,
it gets better. A couple more things. One that you'll hear all the time, it's repeated like people are zombies. They say it's non-provenance. Okay, makes sense. And the reason that these scholars say this, we don't want to encourage antiquities theft. We don't want somebody to say, hey, look, I got some antiquities, but I can't tell you where I got it. I mean, that's just bad business.
Right.
And it encourages theft. So I get that. But here's the deal. They said there's no way it survived. It wouldn't have survived. Now, let me tell you a couple more details quickly that go with that. Number one, the leather, and I'm still working on some of this. This is a replica again. It's a little bit bigger than it was actually.
Sure.
But it was letter to letter, back to back. It was coated on the back with an asphalt type coating. And so notice the asphalt's never going to touch the letters. This is the paleo writing. But it did over time bleed through. But we believe that it was done for the purpose of keeping it flexible. Now, whenever it was also, they found it had linen stuck to it. Now, when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, they had linen stuck to them.
So this is
they
the
had
same
asphalt, and not only that, written in paleo.
Same thing, yeah.
But before this, there was nothing ever found written on leather in paleo.
I got this is going to be a tough question right here.
Yeah.
Does any of the Dead Sea Scrolls have those dots?
Yes.
They do?
Yes, they do.
Wow.
So you were looking at it.
For anyone who has no idea what I'm talking about, in this text there are these dots in between the words.
Right.
And a lot of ancient Hebrew doesn't do that. There are no dots in between.
Here you go. Here's an example. Here.
And so scholars saw that and said, that's later.
Well, what they actually said, it's worse than that. They felt like the forger was copying from lapidary, from stone inscriptions. Here's what they knew. They had the Moabite stela, the Mesha stone. They had that, and they saw there are dots between words. The Siloam inscription is discovered in 1880. It had dots, but they had never seen it used on leather, so they said the forger is trying to play like he knows about ancient writing.
Right.
Well, now we know, Emmanuel Tove says that at Qumran, there are 13 manuscripts written in Paleo-Hebrew.
Just like this.
Yes, they are written in Paleo, and they have the word dividers.
I got to say, this
forger
is
wouldn't
very
know.
convincing.
He wouldn't know.
This is very convincing.
He wouldn't know.
We're going to go deeper into this, and you can check out part 2 of this video on his Patreon.
And I want you guys to shoot it down.
Yeah.
That's what I want. I don't want people to think, oh, yeah, I believe it. Look at the evidence and see what you think.
And you have just attained true gnosis.
What is it that's shocking, maybe, that we find in there that we don't find in our Bible?
The whole thing is shocking. Let me give you a couple of quick examples. Number one, the 10 words are different. Okay? The 10 Commandments. First of all, everyone knows who's studied, if you study religion in general, how do you count the 10 Commandments? Right? They're supposed to be 10. They're called Aser HaDevarim. They're supposed to be 10. How do you count them? The Catholics, the Jews, the Lutherans, everybody counts them different because they're trying to make 10 and they just can't get there. And then you have Exodus and Deuteronomy don't agree. Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 don't agree. And then some scholars propose that Exodus chapter 34 is an ancient priestly version of the 10 words. Some propose that Leviticus 19 is a different. This one is unique. Why? Because it doesn't match either, but it makes a lot more sense, and I'll build on that.